This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. The neighborhood of Palm Grove was a place of manicured lawns, white picket fences, and picture-perfect families. It was the kind of suburban oasis that seemed untouched by the chaos of the outside world. The streets were lined with pastel-colored houses, each one almost identical to the next, with neatly trimmed hedges and American flags fluttering proudly from porches. The air always smelled faintly of fresh-cut grass and chlorine from backyard pools. It was, by all accounts, the embodiment of the American dream, at least on the surface, but beneath the pristine facade lay something darker, something rotten. And for Amina Malik, it wasn't just the neighborhood that felt wrong. It was everything. Amina had lived in Palm Grove for 4 years, ever since her family moved from New York City to escape the high cost of living and find what her father called a better life. Her father, Rashid, was a stern but kind man who worked long hours driving a delivery truck. Her mother, Yasmin, spent her days caring for Amina's younger brother, Kareem, and baking sweets to sell at the local farmers market. The Maliks were quiet, private people, and they did their best to assimilate into the community. But no matter how hard they tried, they always seemed like outsiders in Palm Grove. The neighbors were polite, but their smiles never quite reached their eyes. Invitations to block parties and potlucks were always extended, but there was an unspoken distance, a feeling that the Maliks were tolerated, not accepted. For Amina, the neighborhood was a cage disguised as a paradise. She felt the weight of its suffocating sameness pressing down on her every time she stepped outside. She could see it in the way the neighbors watched her as she walked to school in her hijab, their eyes lingering just a little too long. She could hear it in the hushed whispers that followed her in the grocery store aisles, the subtle but pointed comments about those people. Even the kids at school weren't subtle. They called her names, mocked her accent, despite the fact that she'd been born in the United States, and made jokes about terrorism whenever she passed by. Amina learned quickly not to react. Any sign of anger or sadness only made it worse. The neighborhood itself seemed to conspire against her. The homes, with their pastel exteriors and cheerful flower beds, felt like they were mocking her family's modest brick house, the only one on the block without a sprawling front lawn or a gleaming SUV in the driveway. The palm trees that lined the streets swayed gently in the breeze, as if they were whispering secrets to each other. And the sun always seemed just a little too bright, casting harsh shadows that made everything look distorted. Amina often thought about how different it had been in New York, where the chaos of the city had offered a kind of anonymity. Here, in Palm Grove, there was nowhere to hide. At night, the neighborhood transformed. The tidy streets became eerily silent, and the warm glow of porch lights cast long, flickering shadows across the pavement. Amina's room faced the street, and she often found herself staring out the window, watching the darkness creep over the neighborhood like a living thing. She imagined the shadows slithering into the perfect homes, seeping into the walls and curling around the sleeping families. While sometimes she thought she could feel the darkness pressing against her own windows, like it was trying to get in. Other times, she wondered if it was already inside. There were moments when the silence was broken. Soft footsteps on the pavement, the distant bark of a dog, or the sound of laughter drifting from an open window. But those sounds only made the stillness more oppressive, like the neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Amina felt it too, that sense of anticipation. It was a heavy, suffocating presence, and it followed her everywhere. She couldn't explain it, but she knew something was wrong with Palm Grove. It wasn't just the subtle racism or the oppressive conformity. It was something deeper, something she couldn't quite put into words. And whatever it was growing. One afternoon, as Amina walked home from school, she noticed a dead bird on the sidewalk. Its small body was twisted, its wings bent at unnatural angles, and its glassy eyes stared blankly at the sky. Flies buzzed around it, their tiny wings shimmering in the sunlight. Amina stopped to look at it, her stomach twisting with a mix of disgust and fascination. She knelt down and noticed a thin trail of blood running from its beak, pooling on the concrete. She glanced around, but no one else seemed to notice. The houses stood silent, their windows dark and unblinking. She stood up quickly and walked away, but the image of the bird stayed with her, lodged in her mind like a splinter. That night, she dreamed of the bird. In her dream, it wasn't dead. It was alive, but it couldn't fly. Its wings were broken, and it flapped them frantically, trying to lift off the ground. Amina watched as it struggled, its movements growing weaker and weaker, until it finally collapsed. When she woke up, her chest felt tight, like something heavy was sitting on it. She looked out the window and saw the same darkness creeping over the neighborhood, the same shadows stretching across the pavement. But this time, it felt different. This time, it felt like the darkness was watching her. Amina's parents didn't notice the change in her. They were too busy trying to keep up appearances, trying to prove to the neighbors that they belonged in Palm Grove. But Amina noticed. She felt it in the way her heart raced whenever she walked past a neighbor's house, in the way her hands trembled when she thought about school, in the way her dreams were filled with images of blood and broken things. She started spending more time in her room, isolating herself from her family and the world outside. Her grades, once perfect, began to slip, and her teachers started calling home. But even then, no one seemed to notice what was really happening. No one saw the storm building inside her. Palm Grove was a quiet neighborhood. Too quiet. It was the kind of place where people pretended not to see the cracks in the facade, where they turned a blind eye to anything that didn't fit their ideal of perfection. But Amina saw the cracks. She felt them growing wider every day, threatening to swallow her whole. And deep down, she knew she couldn't escape them. Something permanent. The days in Palm Grove began to blur together for Amina Malik. Each one felt like an identical copy of the last, a monotonous loop of alienation and quiet dread. School became a gauntlet of stares and whispered insults, a daily reminder that she was an outsider. The halls were filled with laughter and chatter, but none of it ever seemed to include her. The cafeteria was worse, a cacophony of clinking trays and overlapping conversations, where her silence was like a spotlight. She learned to eat quickly, head down, her hijab like a target on her back. The whispered slurs, the snickers from the table behind her, they had started to fade into background noise. She told herself it didn't bother her, but the truth was, it stuck to her like tar, seeping into her thoughts and staining everything. At home, the isolation was different, quieter but no less suffocating. Her parents were always busy, her father exhausted from long shifts on the road, and her mother consumed with Karim's endless demands for attention. Amina often felt invisible in her own home, a shadow slipping through the halls. She would sit in her room for hours, the only sound the faint hum of her laptop or the occasional creak of the house settling. The walls of her room seemed to close in on her, the pale blue paint taking on a cold, lifeless hue in the dim light of her desk lamp. She began to think of her room as a kind of cocoon, a space where the world couldn't reach her. But instead of feeling safe, she felt trapped, like something inside her was being smothered. It was during one of those long, lonely nights that Amina first stumbled upon the videos. It had started innocently enough, a documentary about true crime, something to distract her from the heaviness in her chest. But as she clicked from one video to the next, the stories became darker, more graphic. She found herself drawn to tales of serial killers, their cold, calculated actions recounted in chilling detail. The precision of their methods fascinated her, the way they seemed to operate outside the rules of society, untouchable and unstoppable. They weren't victims. They weren't powerless. They were in control. The algorithms began to feed her more. Before long, her YouTube recommendations were a gallery of horror, unsolved murders, infamous crime scenes, and detailed dissections of killers' psyches. She learned about the methods, poison, strangulation, blunt force trauma. She learned about patterns and signatures, about how some killers left marks to taunt the police, or chose victims who symbolized something deeper. It wasn't just the violence that captivated her. It was the psychology behind it. The way these people, outcasts in their own right, turned their pain into power. The stories filled her with a strange kind of clarity, a dark understanding that she couldn't put into words. They spoke to a part of her she hadn't realized was there, a part that had been growing in the shadows of her mind. Amina started keeping a notebook. At first, it was just a way to organize her thoughts, a place to jot down interesting facts or details she wanted to remember. But the notebook quickly became something more. She filled its pages with diagrams, sketches, and lists. She wrote about poisons, how they worked, where to find them, how to administer them without detection. She drew crude maps of the neighborhood, marking the houses of the people she hated most, noting their routines and vulnerabilities. It felt good to write it all down, to take the swirling chaos in her head and turn it into something concrete. It felt like control. Her nights grew longer. She would stay up until the early hours of the morning, the glow of her laptop casting eerie shadows across her room. She found forums where people discussed crime, some from a detached analytical perspective and others with a disturbing enthusiasm. She never posted, but she read everything, her eyes devouring the words on the screen. But others were careful, methodical, their advice disturbingly practical. Amina gravitated toward the latter, absorbing their tips and strategies like a student preparing for an exam. She started to notice changes in herself. Her thoughts, once scattered and restless, became sharper, more focused. The helplessness she had felt for so long began to fade, replaced by something harder, colder. She started to see the neighborhood differently. The pristine lawns and cheerful facades no longer felt mocking, they felt vulnerable. The neighbors, with their polite smiles and thinly veiled disdain, no longer seemed untouched. They were just people, flesh and blood, as breakable as anyone else. She began to imagine what it would feel like to shatter their perfect little world, to make them feel the way they had made her feel. The first time she thought about killing someone, it scared her. The thought came unbidden, a sudden, vivid image that flashed through her mind as she walked past Mrs. Collins's house. She saw herself slipping into the backyard at night, a pair of garden shears in her hand. She saw the shock on Mrs. Collins's face, the blood pooling on the neatly trimmed grass. The image was gone as quickly as it came, but it left her shaken. She tried to push it away, to tell herself it was just a passing thought, nothing serious. But the more she tried to ignore it, the more it lingered, growing roots in the dark corners of her mind. She started taking long walks at night, her steps silent on the empty streets. The darkness felt different now, less oppressive and more like a companion. She would walk past the houses of her neighbors, her eyes scanning the windows for signs of life. She learned which families left their doors unlocked, which ones had dogs, which ones never seemed to notice anything out of the ordinary. She told herself it was just curiosity, but deep down she knew it was more than that. She was studying them, learning their weaknesses, preparing herself for something she couldn't yet name. The dead bird she had seen on the sidewalk weeks ago came back to her one night as she stood outside the Johnsons' house, watching the flickering blue light of their television through the window. She remembered the way its body had looked, broken and bloodied, and she wondered if it had felt any pain. She wondered if it had known it was dying. Instead, it filled her with a strange, quiet satisfaction. Life was fragile, and the power to take it away was intoxicating. Amina's notebook grew thicker, its pages crammed with details and plans. Her fantasies became more vivid, more detailed, until they no longer felt like fantasies at all. They felt like inevitabilities. She told herself she was just imagining, just exploring the darkest corners of her mind. But as the weeks passed, the line between thought and action began to blur. The darkness that had once felt like it was watching her now felt like it was inside her, whispering in her ear, guiding her hand. And she didn't want it to stop. The annual Palm Grove Neighborhood Barbecue was one of those events that everyone in the community was expected to attend. For one afternoon each year, the carefully guarded fences of suburban life were temporarily lowered, and neighbors gathered in a haze of grill smoke, laughter, and polite small talk. Tables groaned under the weight of potluck dishes, casseroles, pies, coleslaw, and deviled eggs. Children raced around the lawns with water guns, their shrill screams echoing through the air. The adults sipped cold beers and lemonades, their conversations a mix of mundane gossip and shallow pleasantries. It was an image of perfect community harmony, a moment where everyone could pretend that life in Palm Grove really was as idyllic as it seemed. Amina Malik dreaded the barbecue from the moment the flyer was slipped into their mailbox. Her parents, ever eager to blend in, insisted on going. Her mother spent the morning preparing a platter of homemade samosas, carefully arranging them on a tray lined with paper doilies. Amina tried to protest, but her mother wouldn't hear it. "It's important for us to show face," she had said, in her usual stern tone, her hands deftly folding the edges of the samosas. Amina had no choice but to comply. She dressed in her usual modest attire, a long skirt and a blouse, her hijab pinned neatly in place. She hated how out of place she felt in these settings, how her family's food, clothing, and even their presence seemed to draw attention. But there was no avoiding it. When they arrived, the tension was immediate. The hum of conversation seemed to pause for a split second as the Maliks stepped into the backyard, the air heavy with the smell of grilled meat and sunscreen. The neighbors greeted them with polite but strained smiles, the kind that didn't quite reach their eyes. Mrs. Collins, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, was the first to approach. She wore her usual wide-brimmed hat and a floral sundress, her teeth gleaming unnaturally white as she complimented Yasmin's samosas. Amina could tell her mother was proud of the dish, but she also knew it would sit untouched for most of the afternoon. Outshone by the more familiar offerings of potato salad and baked beans, Amina found a corner of the yard where she could remain unnoticed, clutching a paper plate and nibbling at a piece of dry cornbread. She watched the scene unfold around her, a blur of pastel dresses, polo shirts, and carefully curated smiles. Her father was speaking with a group of men near the grill, his posture stiff, his laugh forced. Her mother stood near the food table, chatting awkwardly with a few women who clearly had little interest in what she was saying. Karyam was running around with a group of boys, trying to keep up but clearly being excluded from their game. Amina felt the familiar ache of alienation settle in her chest, a dull, heavy weight that refused to leave. It was Mrs. Collins who shattered the fragile equilibrium of the day. She had been mingling effortlessly, her laugh ringing out like a bell as she moved from group to group, but then, in the middle of the afternoon, she suddenly turned her attention to Kareem. He had been playing near the edge of the yard where a cluster of bikes leaned against the fence. Mrs. Collins's son, a boy named Chase, stormed over to her, his face red with anger. His words were loud enough for everyone to hear. "Mom, he's touching my bike!" A ripple of silence spread through the yard as heads turned toward the commotion. Mrs. Collins swept across the lawn, her hat casting a long shadow over Kareem, who froze under her glare. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp and cutting. Amina watched from her corner, her stomach twisting into knots. She could see the fear in Kareem's eyes, the way his hands trembled as he tried to explain himself, but Mrs. Collins didn't give him a chance. "These bikes aren't yours," she said, her voice rising. "We don't take things that don't belong to us in this neighborhood." The words hung in the air like a noose. Amina saw the way the neighbors exchanged glances, the subtle smirks and raised eyebrows. She wanted to scream, to rush over and pull Kareem away, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. Her parents had noticed the commotion by now. Her father started to step forward, his face dark with anger, but Mrs. Collins cut him off. "You need to teach your children some respect," she said loudly, her gaze shifting to Rashid. "This isn't the first time we've had issues, and I think I speak for everyone here when I say we've been more than patient." Amina felt a surge of heat rise in her chest, a fiery mix of rage and humiliation. The words hit like blows, each one landing harder than the last. She could see the color drain from her mother's face, the way her father's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The neighbors were no longer trying to hide their reactions. Some looked uncomfortable, but others watched with thinly veiled satisfaction, as if they had been waiting for this moment. The samosas on the table suddenly seemed like a cruel joke, a desperate attempt at acceptance that had been met with disdain. Kareem stammered an apology, his voice barely audible, but Mrs. Collins waved it off with a dramatic sigh. "It's not just about the bike," she said, turning to address the crowd now, her voice full of righteous indignation. "It's about respect. We all work hard to maintain this community, and it's important that everyone does their part to uphold our standards." Amina's father tried to speak, his voice trembling with suppressed anger, but Mrs. Collins cut him off again. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "But maybe it's time to have a serious conversation about what it means to be a good neighbor." The words hit Amina like a slap. Her vision blurred as tears stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She bit down on the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood, her nails digging into her palms so hard they left crescent-shaped marks. The barbecue continued around them, but the mood had shifted. The laughter was forced now, the conversation strained. Her family stood frozen, a tableau of shame and anger, as the rest of the neighborhood resumed their charade of normalcy. When it was finally over, the Maliks left without a word. The walk back to their house was silent, the air heavy with unspoken tension. Amina could feel the humiliation radiating off her parents, could see the way her father's shoulders slumped and her mother's hands fidgeted with the edge of her scarf. Kareem clung to his mother's side, his small frame trembling with the aftershocks of the confrontation. Amina walked behind them, her fists still clenched, her mind a storm of thoughts she couldn't control. That night, as she sat in her room staring at the darkened window, something inside her broke. The humiliation of the day replayed in her mind on an endless loop, each detail sharper than the last. The sneers, the whispers, Mrs. Collins's smug, self-righteous tone, they all fed the fire that was building in her chest. For years, she had endured the quiet racism, the thinly veiled hostility, the constant feeling of not belonging. But this was different. This was public, deliberate, designed to strip her family of their dignity. And Amina knew, with a cold certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she couldn't let it go unanswered. The darkness outside her window seemed to shift, pressing closer, wrapping itself around her like a second skin. A single thought crystallized in her mind, clear and unyielding. She wouldn't let them win. They had taken everything from her, her pride, her sense of safety, her identity, but she would take something back, something they would never forget. The night Palm Grove began to unravel was unremarkable on the surface, calm, warm, and quiet, just like any other. The streets were bathed in the soft orange glow of the streetlights, the shadows of palm trees stretching long and thin across the pavement. Inside their perfect homes, the neighbors of Palm Grove slept soundly, their dreams undisturbed by the darkness that had quietly taken root in one of their own. Amina Malik stood at her bedroom window, staring out at the silent neighborhood. Her plan was ready. It had been ready for weeks, carefully crafted in the pages of her notebook, each step mapped out with meticulous precision. She felt a strange sense of calm, as though everything that had been coiled tight inside her for so long was finally beginning to unwind. Tonight, her first target was Mrs. Collins. Amina had thought long and hard about where to start, and it always came back to her. Mrs. Collins was the face of Palm Grove, its unspoken leader, the woman who decided who belonged and who didn't. She was the one who had humiliated her family, who had turned her brother into a scapegoat and reduced her parents to silence. Amina had spent countless nights imagining the look on Mrs. Collins's face when she realized her perfect world was crumbling. She wanted her to feel powerless, to feel the weight of fear pressing down on her chest until it suffocated her. And so, it was only fitting that Mrs. Collins would be the first. Amina had studied Mrs. Collins' routine with the precision of a predator stalking its prey. She knew that Mrs. Collins walked her dog, a small, yapping thing named Peanut, every night at precisely 10 p.m. She always took the same route, looping around the block before returning to her immaculate house on the corner. Amina had watched her from the shadows, noting every detail, the way she held the leash loosely in one hand, her phone in the other, always distracted, always oblivious to the world around her. It would be easy. She left the house just before 10, slipping out through the back door while her parents and brother slept. The streets were empty, the air still and heavy. She wore dark clothes and carried a small bottle in her pocket, its contents carefully prepared in secret. She had learned about it online, an odorless, tasteless substance that could be deadly in the right dose. She had practiced mixing it, testing it on stray animals she found near the edge of the neighborhood, She hated the look in their eyes as they convulsed and died, but she told herself it was necessary. She needed to be sure it would work. She waited in the shadows near the edge of the park, her heart pounding in her chest. She heard Mrs. Collins before she saw her, the sound of Peanut's high-pitched barks carrying through the still night. Amina pressed herself against a tree, holding her breath as Mrs. Collins passed by. She looked exactly as she always did, complacent, self-assured, utterly unaware of the danger lurking just a few feet away. Amina waited until she was out of sight before slipping onto the path behind her. She followed at a distance, her steps silent on the pavement, her eyes fixed on the small figure ahead of her. When the moment came, it was almost too easy. Mrs. Collins paused near the park bench, bending down to adjust Peanut's leash. Amina approached quietly, her movements careful and deliberate. She slipped the poisoned treat from her pocket, her fingers trembling slightly as she tossed it onto the path ahead of the dog. Peanut sniffed the air, his tail wagging as he darted forward to snatch up the morsel. Amina turned and walked away quickly, her pulse racing as she disappeared into the shadows. She didn't stop until she was back in her room, the door locked behind her. She sat on her bed, her breathing shallow, her hands shaking. She didn't know how long it would take for the poison to work, but she knew it wouldn't be long. The news spread quickly the next morning. Peanut had collapsed and died on the side of the road, his small body convulsing violently before going still. Mrs. Collins was inconsolable, her cries echoing through the neighborhood as she clutched the lifeless dog in her arms. The neighbors gathered, their faces grim as they murmured about what could have happened. Some suggested it was an accident. Others whispered about foul play. Before lunch, I asked her what had happened. Amina watched from her window, her face expressionless, her hands folded in her lap. It was only the beginning. Her next target was Mr. Johnson, the man who lived 2 houses down. He was a gruff, unfriendly man who had once accused her father of parking his truck too close to his driveway. Amina remembered the way he had sneered at her father, his words dripping with disdain. She had always hated him. His condescension, his arrogance, the way he acted as though he owned the entire street. He had a habit of leaving his garage door open late at night, tinkering with his car long after everyone else had gone to bed. Amina knew this because she had watched him, her eyes tracing the patterns of his movements, memorizing his habits. That night, she waited until the neighborhood was quiet before slipping out of the house again. She crept through the shadows, the weight of the hammer in her hand both comforting and terrifying. She had taken it from her father's toolbox, wiping it clean of fingerprints and wrapping it in a cloth to muffle the sound. She approached the garage carefully, her footsteps light on the pavement. Mr. Johnson was bent over the engine of his car, his back to her, the glow of the work light casting long shadows across the walls. He didn't hear her approach. He didn't even have time to turn around. The blow was quick and precise, just as she had planned. The hammer connected with the back of his head with a sickening crunch, and he crumpled to the ground without a sound. Amina stood over him, her chest heaving, her hands trembling as she dropped the hammer beside him. She didn't stay to watch. She turned and walked away, her steps steady, her mind oddly clear. She knew someone would find him in the morning, that the neighborhood would be thrown into chaos once again, and that was exactly what she wanted. Over the next few weeks, the killings continued. Each one was different, carefully planned to avoid suspicion. A fire set in the backyard shed of the Jacksons, the flames consuming everything before the fire department could arrive. A batch of cookies laced with poison left on the doorstep of the Robinsons with a note signed, "A Friendly Neighbor." A gas leak in the home of the Thompsons, the explosion shaking the entire block. Each death was a message, a piece of the puzzle that only Amina could see. The neighbors grew paranoid, their once perfect community unraveling as fear took hold. They installed security cameras, locked their doors, and whispered about the possibility of a killer in their midst. But no one suspected Amina. She was just a quiet girl, an invisible shadow in the background of their lives. As the body count rose, Amina felt a strange sense of satisfaction. She had taken control of the neighborhood that had once controlled her, turned their perfect world into a nightmare they couldn't escape. But with each killing, the darkness inside her grew. It whispered to her in the quiet moments, urging her forward, telling her she couldn't stop now. And she knew, deep down, that it was right. There was no going back. The fear in Palm Grove had become palpable, an almost living thing that clung to every corner of the neighborhood. Once a place of manicured perfection and forced pleasantries, it now felt suffocating, heavy with suspicion and dread. The murders, first dismissed as freak accidents, then whispered about as something far more sinister, had turned the neighbors into strangers. Where people once waved politely to one another while watering their lawns, now they hurried inside, pulling their children along with them. Curtains were drawn, doors double-locked, and the air buzzed with unanswered questions. Who was doing this? And who would be next? Amina Malik watched it all unfold from her bedroom window. Her one-shadowed existence had become a source of comfort. No one looked at her twice. She was the quiet girl, the invisible girl, the one who blended into the background of the neighborhood. It made her untouchable, or so she thought. But the delicate web of her plan, the one she'd crafted so meticulously, was beginning to fray. It started with the smallest mistake. Amina had always been careful, methodical, ensuring there were no loose ends, no evidence that could tie her to the crimes. But the night she killed the Robinsons, her poisoned cookies having sent the elderly couple into convulsions on their kitchen floor, she had overlooked something. The note. It had been a harmless addition, or so she thought at the time, a sick joke to mock the very idea of neighborly kindness. A friendly neighbor, she had written in looping, careful script. But in her rush, she hadn't noticed the tiny smudge of ink on the back of the note, a partial fingerprint pressed into the paper. The rookie detective assigned to the case, Sarah Coleman, wasn't the type of person Amina had planned for. She wasn't seasoned or cynical, the kind of officer who might overlook details in favor of a larger narrative. She was young, eager, and sharp in ways that made her dangerous. While the more experienced investigators chalked up the string of deaths to random tragedy or coincidental misfortune, she saw intention. And when the fingerprint came back, partial as it was, it raised more questions than answers. At first, the detectives didn't know what to make of it. The print didn't match anyone in the criminal database, which wasn't surprising in a quiet suburban neighborhood. But Detective Coleman's instincts told her to dig deeper, to look at the overlooked, the invisible. She started compiling a list of everyone in Palm Grove, knocking on doors, asking subtle but pointed questions. When Coleman came to the Malik household, Amina felt the first crack in her carefully constructed armor. The detective stood on their porch, her presence radiating an intensity that set Amina's nerves on edge. She had the kind of eyes that seemed to see straight through you, peeling back layers of pretense to expose whatever lay hidden beneath. Amina stood silently behind her father as he answered Coleman's questions. She kept her face neutral, her body still, but her mind was racing. Coleman asked about their routines, their interactions with the neighbors, whether they had noticed anything unusual in recent weeks. Amina's father, ever polite, answered each question calmly, though there was a flicker of discomfort in his voice. Yasmin Malik stood nearby, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her scarf, her eyes darting nervously between the detective and her husband. When Coleman asked about Amina, her father hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding. "She keeps to herself mostly. She's a good girl." It was the hesitation that did it. Coleman's gaze shifted to Amina, lingering just a moment too long. Amina felt the weight of it, the way the detective's eyes seemed to catalog every detail, her posture, her expression, the way her fingers were curled into the fabric of her skirt. It wasn't suspicion, not yet, but it was something close. Amina forced herself to meet Coleman's gaze, holding it for a beat longer than she wanted to before looking away. When Coleman left, Amina's parents breathed a collective sigh of relief. But Amina didn't. She knew the visit hadn't been routine. Coleman had felt something, sensed something. And Amina knew that feeling would only grow. In the days that followed, Coleman began to focus more of her attention on Amina. She returned to the Malik house under the guise of follow-up questions, her eyes always lingering on Amina, her tone casual but probing. She started speaking to Amina's teachers, her classmates, anyone who might offer insight into the quiet, withdrawn girl. Amina could feel the walls closing in, the careful distance she had maintained between herself and the crimes shrinking with each passing day. But the unraveling wasn't just external, it was inside her too. The calm, detached focus that had guided her through each step of her plan was beginning to fracture. She started making small mistakes, leaving her notebook out on her desk instead of hiding it, forgetting to lock her bedroom door when she went out. Her sleep became restless, haunted by visions of the faces of the people she had killed. In her dreams, they stared at her with hollow eyes, their mouths open in silent accusation. One night, as she flipped through the pages of her notebook, she realized she was trembling. The pages were filled with the cold logic of her plans. Maps, timelines, chemical formulas. But now they seemed foreign, alien. The person who had written them felt like a stranger, someone distant and unrecognizable. She closed the notebook and shoved it under her mattress, her heart pounding in her chest. Coleman wasn't the only one noticing changes in Amina. Her parents, though preoccupied with their own struggles, began to sense that something was wrong. Her mother would linger in her doorway, watching her with a concerned expression, as though trying to decipher a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. Her father, normally quiet and reserved, started asking questions about her grades, her friends, why she spent so much time alone in her room. Amina brushed them off, offering vague answers and forced smiles, but she could feel their worry growing. The tipping point came on a rainy evening, when Coleman appeared at their door once more, this time with a search warrant. Amina's parents were confused, outraged, but Coleman was calm, methodical, her presence a storm contained within itself. As officers moved through the house, opening drawers and flipping through papers, Amina sat silently on the couch, her hands clenched in her lap. She knew what they were looking for. When they found the notebook, the room fell into a heavy silence. Coleman opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the pages. Amina could see the change in her expression, the way her professional detachment shifted into something darker. Horror. Realization. The officers murmured to one another, their voices low but urgent. Amina's parents demanded an explanation, their voices rising, but Amina stayed silent. She knew it was over. The web she had spun so carefully had finally collapsed, and she was caught at the center of it. As they placed her in handcuffs, leading her out into the rain-soaked night, she felt a strange mix of emotions: fear, shame, and a small, defiant spark of pride. They had finally seen her, really seen her, and they would never forget. The neighbors watched from their windows as she was led away, their faces pale and shocked. Palm Grove, their perfect little paradise, would never be the same. And neither would Amina. The interrogation room was colder than Amina had imagined it would be. The walls were a muted gray, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead, casting harsh shadows on the scuffed metal table in front of her. She sat in the hard plastic chair with her wrists cuffed to the table, the cold steel biting into her skin. The room smelled faintly of bleach and stale coffee, a sterile reminder of how far she had fallen. Across from her sat Detective Sarah Coleman, her face impassive but her eyes razor-sharp. Between them, the notebook lay open, its pages a damning testament to everything Amina had done. The room felt smaller with Coleman in it. Her presence was heavy, oppressive, like the weight of a storm about to break. Amina had been silent for hours, staring at the table, the walls, anywhere but at the detective. But silence wasn't enough anymore. Coleman was relentless, chipping away at her with a calm, quiet persistence that was somehow worse than shouting. She didn't accuse, didn't threaten. She just laid the facts bare, one by one, peeling back the layers of Amina's secrets until there was nowhere left to hide. The notebook was enough to incriminate her, but Coleman wanted more. She wanted Amina to say it, to confess, to lay bare the twisted logic behind her actions. And slowly, as the hours dragged on, Amina began to crack. It started with a flicker of a smirk, a momentary lapse in her mask of indifference. Coleman caught it immediately, her sharp eyes narrowing as she leaned forward. The smirk became a smile, then a laugh, low, bitter, and joyless. Amina couldn't stop herself. The absurdity of it all, the years of pain and resentment and invisibility that had led her to this moment, spilled out in that laugh. And then she started to talk. Her voice was steady, calm, almost detached as she recounted each murder in vivid detail. She spoke of the poison, the hammer, the fire. She described the meticulous planning, the satisfaction of watching the neighborhood unravel, the thrill of knowing she was the one pulling the strings. There was no remorse in her words, no apologies or excuses. She spoke as though she were describing someone else's actions, a story she had watched unfold from a safe distance. But her eyes betrayed her. They burned with something fierce, something raw and primal that made Coleman lean back in her chair, her calm exterior faltering for the first time. Amina didn't stop until she had laid it all out, every detail, every motive. She spoke of the humiliation, the alienation, the quiet rage that had built inside her for years. She told Coleman about the barbecue, about the dead bird on the sidewalk, about the nights she spent watching her neighbors through the window, imagining how easily their perfect lives could be shattered. She told her about the darkness, how it had wrapped itself around her like a shroud, whispering in her ear, guiding her hand. When she finished, the room fell into a heavy silence. Coleman sat back in her chair, her face pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table. She had heard confessions before, violent, desperate, deranged, but this was different. Amina's voice was calm, almost serene, as though she had finally found peace in admitting what she had done. There was no trace of guilt, no flicker of doubt. It was terrifying in its certainty. The trial that followed was a media spectacle, the kind of case that gripped the nation and refused to let go. The headlines were lurid, sensational. Teen killer terrorizes Florida suburb, the quiet girl with a deadly plan. From outsider to monster. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, their cameras flashing as Amina was led inside, her face expressionless, her hands cuffed tightly in front of her. The courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and the surviving residents of Palm Grove. The neighbors who had once ignored Amina now couldn't take their eyes off her. They whispered to each other, their voices a mix of horror and morbid fascination. Mrs. Collins sat in the front row, her face pale and drawn, her hands clutching a tissue that she twisted and tore as the trial went on. Amina's parents sat on the opposite side of the room, their faces a mask of grief and disbelief. They couldn't reconcile the girl they had raised with the monster the world now saw her as. The prosecution painted Amina as a cold, calculating killer, a young woman devoid of empathy or remorse. They described her notebook in detail, reading passages aloud to the jury, the words echoing through the courtroom like a grim manifesto. The defense tried to argue that Amina's actions were the result of years of bullying and isolation, that she was a product of her environment, a victim lashing out at a world that had failed her. But even her lawyer seemed to struggle with the weight of what she had done. The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. Amina was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge's words were stern, final, but Amina barely heard them. She sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her face impassive. When they led her out of the courtroom, she didn't look at her parents, didn't acknowledge the angry stares of the neighbors or the flash of the cameras, and she kept her head high, her gaze fixed on some distant point, as though she were already somewhere else. Life in Palm Grove didn't return to normal after Amina's arrest. The neighborhood was forever scarred, its carefully curated image of perfection shattered beyond repair. The houses that had once been symbols of safety and prosperity now stood as monuments to paranoia and fear. Families moved away, their for sale signs standing like grave markers on the once pristine lawns. The barbecue was never held again, the park at the center of the community now empty and overgrown. So, as soon as my father was away from park, Leo never got his revenge. Like he was never loved by anyone, and in the Park of the Flowers, the barbecue was never loved by anyone. The Malik's house was the first to sell. Rashid and Yasmin left the neighborhood in silence, their car packed with everything they could carry, their faces etched with the weight of shame and grief. No one came to say goodbye. No one waved as they drove away. In prison, Amina became something of a legend. Inmates whispered about her, the girl who had taken down an entire neighborhood, who had stared down the world without flinching. Some admired her, others feared her, but no one ignored her. She spent her days reading, writing, and watching the world move on without her. Sometimes, at night, she would lie awake in her cell, staring at the cracks in the ceiling. She thought about Palm Grove, about the streets she had walked, the lives she had taken, the darkness that had consumed her. And in those moments, she felt nothing. No regret, no guilt, no sadness. Only the faintest flicker of satisfaction, a quiet reminder that she had done what no one else could. She had made them see her, and she knew deep down that they would never forget.